Thank you. Where's my husband? There. Norman. Oh, Norman. Did you get one? Well, I'll take one and pass it. He gave one to me to pass around, but I'm not going to get up and walk around.
I hope so. Okay. Good Shabbos.
My clients are going to call me before that.
9 o'clock. Hello at home. Hope you can hear me. God willing.
We have to find a way to attract some younger.
You've got a job here.
Attract anybody.
Off the street.
Yeah, anyone.
Tell them free bagels, and by the way, if you sit in for Torah Study, you get an extra
Yeah.
bagel. They go.
Well, school's out till Monday, so a lot of families are still out of town. So expected a little bit of a smaller crowd today.
How much is here?
What?
You ever count the house?
Yeah, I usually make 40 copies, so however many are left. I know. Sometimes we run out, usually we don't.
We can make you feel good. We'll pay extra copies.
The way we counted the house is we counted
The empty seat.
Yeah. I don't know, they put out different number of seats every time, though.
Last night was a very nice turnout.
Yeah, because we did it in here. If we did it in there, it would be empty. But it was good. For an off week, it was good. Okay, here we go. Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Shabbat Shalom.
We got a lot to get to, so let's get going. New book of Torah. Shmot. Uh, 6:20. Okay, here we go. V'shamru v'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat lahasod et ha-Shabbat v'dorotam berit olam v'shamru v'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם. ביני ובין בני ישראל אותי לעולם אותי לעולם. ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם. כי ששת ימים עשה אדוני את השמיים ואת הארץ ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם. וביום השביעי שבת וינפש, שבת וינפש, שבת וינפש, ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם בורא פרי הגפן אמן. לחיים. Okay, and the blessing for our study of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Amen. Okay. Now we're up to Shmot, Exodus, the first Torah portion in the second book of the Torah, and there's a lot of good stuff here, as usual. but this is the part of the Torah that maybe we know best because of Pesach, because Pesach works, right? Because you have this thing called the Seder twice a year, and you tell the story. And so most people are somewhat familiar with it, or maybe you saw the movie. Or
the Rembrandt picture, you know.
This is one case where the movie's definitely not as good as the book. Sometimes the movie's better. Rarely, but sometimes. Okay, so let's jump into it. We're going to begin with chapter 2, as opposed to chapter 1. Because what I want to focus on is the family dynamic that Moses grows up in, which is very interesting and often glossed over because it happens so fast. In other words, his entire childhood happens in a couple of verses. And if I asked you what was on Moses' college application, in other words, in high school, what did he do besides study? Colleges want to really get to know who you are. In the minute and a half that they spend on your application, they want to get to know who you really are. So,
He'd be good at rowing because
it was on the crew team. Sure. By the way, I saw the movie The Boys in the Boat. Anyone see that movie?
How was it?
Wonderful. Yeah, great movie. I didn't read the book, but I have to tell you how ironic it is that this movie, The Boys in the Boat, about a story of these athletes from the University of Washington, of all years to come out, the year that University of Washington is in the championship of the football game, it's uncanny. I mean, you couldn't plan that, All right. So Moses grows up, and, we know from his days rowing crew, right, when he was 3 months old, to the now all of a sudden, there's one verse that says, Vayigadel Moshe, Moses grew up. And now he's on to seeing that his people are being oppressed. And so a good question might be, what happened in those formative years, growing up in the palace or wherever he was, and what was the difference in his relationship between his relationship with the Pharaoh's daughter and his real mother and his sister Miriam, who were involved as the midwives, remember? I mean, depending if you're into Midrash. Some of you aren't. Although most of the people who aren't into Midrash over the last 9 years, they've sort of weeded they're not here anymore. All right, so here we go, chapter 2, verse 1. But I'm going to warn you, before we do this, before we even look at it, what are the names of Moses' parents? Anybody know?
Mom and Dad.
Mom and Dad. Good, okay. Okay, Joe said it. His father's name was Amram, and his mother's name was Yocheved. Now, true or false? We get these names only from the Midrash, and they're not in the Torah. Half and half. All right, so I'm going to show you something I think that is spectacular.
Rabbi?
Yes.
At reading this parsha, I try to remember, and I do it with fault, whether or not Moses' wife thought of him as special as he was. What was her attitude towards Moses?
Moses' wife?
His wife.
Yeah, so it's a totally different subject. We're going to get to that next week.
Okay.
Because it's not, but Zipporah obviously saw something very special in him because she wasn't Jewish. And so for her to be able to see that here's this guy who has something special to him. Now, when he came down from I was sort of, you mentioned the word, tzifon, which there's something hidden in Moses which the Torah uses the word saphon. We use a different word for Esther. The word we use to say there's something hidden about Esther is Esther. Because her real name is Hadassah. But we call her Esther. Esther lahastir means to hide. But lahatspin also in Hebrew can mean to hide. And when Moses came down from the mountain, you remember his face was shining. But when he was born, there was also a light, like a different kind of light with him. How do I know that? Because it says so in the Torah. The Torah says when he was born, and we're going to actually take a look at that. I think I brought the verse. I brought the Rashi on it and the verse. We'll take a look at it. But there was something different about him that she recognized. It was, it's not unlike when my wife met me. All right. Now,
the midrash on that.
all right, so look, you're right. Midrash is not as conclusive. Not as. That's what it says. The rabbi sometimes in the Midrash says one rabbi says this, and then it'll say, but all the other rabbis say this. Okay, chapter 2, verse 1. Watch this. So we're trying to figure out, first of all, who are Moses' parents? Now, we know they're Amram and Yocheved, but how do we know that? Is it from the Torah or is it from the Midrash? So let's look where it says, chapter 2, verse 1. Here we go. Norman, please.
A certain member of the house of Levi went and married a woman of Levi. The woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw how beautiful he was, she hid him for 3 months.
Okay, so now, trust me when I tell you that if you continue reading this chapter, you're not going to find the names Amram and Yocheved, nor are they discussed at any length, as you know, going forward in the Torah. But let's try to pick up the clues that we can so far. So we know that Amram, if it is Amram, or whoever this man is marrying within the tribe, right? Literally. He's from Levi, and he's taking a daughter of Levi. Now, does daughter of Levi mean the daughter of Levi? Levi, who was the son of Jacob, who she would be, like 300 years old at this point? Depends who you ask. Depends who you ask. Now, whoever these two people are, she becomes pregnant and they have a son. Now, when it says that she saw he was good, remember the Seinfeld with the ugly baby? Yeah. But most babies are good. Most times you look at a baby and you say, so when the Torah says specifically in verse 2, the woman conceived and gave birth to a son, she saw that he was good. The word that the Torah is v'tereh oto, and she saw him, the baby, ki tov, that it was good. Now, we've heard this before at the beginning of a book of Torah, where someone saw something and said, ki tov, it's good. God saw the light. God saw the light and said, it was good. So the rabbis say that this is a clue that tells us that just as God saw the light was good and God said ki tov, the reason the Torah uses the phrase ki tov and she saw that it was good means that there was some kind of bright light shining from him. Something, I don't know exactly what it was, but something to her that looked unusual and very special. Okay, now if you look at the back of the page, Sforno, Rashi. Rashi said that he was goodly. Goodly means that she saw that it was good. When he was born, the whole house became filled with light. And Rashi takes that from the Talmud, from Sota 12a. So whatever it is, whether it's light, whether it's something else, this woman, who we generally call Yocheved, saw that there was something unique and special about this baby, and so she went and hid him, and that's a whole nother story. Now, and then we get the basket and push down the river. Okay, now, okay, I want to just skip. So we know the whole story. They put Moses in the basket. He gets pushed down the river and so forth. found by the Pharaoh's daughter. She calls him Moses. Moses had other names. But she called him Moses. I mean, what did they call him for the first 3 months? It wasn't until he was 3 months old that he gets the name Moses. Moses is the Egyptian word for to draw out of the water, which you see in verse 10. But what I want to do is skip now to verse 11. Because verses 1 through 10 tell us the story of Moses ending up with Pharaoh's daughter in the basket. And that's it. That's the first 3 months of Moses' life. Verse 11, look what happens. Verse 10 ends the first 3 months of Moses' life. Verse 11, Moses is already grown up. Between verse 10, getting pulled out of the basket by Pharaoh's daughter, and verse 11, between verse 10 and verse 11, Moses grew up. So that's weird, right? We don't know about his childhood. Okay, so now, Edith, if we could look at verse 11.
Sometime after that, when Moses had grown up, he went out to his kinfolk and witnessed their labors. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his kinsmen. He turned this way and that, and seeing no one about, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, he found 2 Hebrews fighting. So he said to the offender, "Why do you strike your fellow?" He retorted, "Who made you chief and ruler over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Moses was frightened and thought, "Then the matter is known." When Pharaoh learned of the matter, he sought to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh. He arrived in the land of Midian and sat down beside a well.
Okay, so if you look close with me at I just want to show you something in verse 10 and verse 11 again. So if we come back to verse 10. So by the way, what happened in Moses' childhood? He reached a point where he grew up. And when he grew up, he recognized that the Jews were slaves. And that he was going to take action. Because until he grew up, he doesn't seem to do anything about the Jews being slaves, but now he does. Israelites, Hebrews, whatever you want to call them, but you know who I mean. But look what happens in verse 10. Something very interesting. The first 2 words in Hebrew of verse 10 are Vayigdal hayeled. Okay, the boy grew up. And she brought him to the daughter of Pharaoh, and he became a son to her, and she called him Moses. So you have in verse 10 that he grew up. Everyone with me on that? So clear that it's in verse 10 that he grew up? Yeah? Okay, now look at verse 11. It happened in those days that Moses grew up. Moses grew up twice. He grew up in verse 10, and he grew up in verse 11. Does everyone see that? So that's weird, right? If I'm reading verse 11, wouldn't I already say, well, wait a minute. I know that already. He grew up in verse 10. Why are you telling me with the exact same word, Vayigdal, literally the exact same word. Now, what's the difference? In verse 10, it says, Vayigdal hayeled, and the boy grew up. And in verse 11, it says, Vayigdal Moshe, and Moses grew up. So you see the slight difference there? Okay.
In verse 10, he grew up to around early high school age. Or
Could be. Could be. I don't know. Okay. We'll go to Ken just because he has them. Oh, you have a mic too? All right, Bobby, then Bill, then Ken, and if we have any time left after that, we'll finish it off.
Could it be that in the beginning, the first part of it, that he just grew up physically, and then after a certain point, he started to grow up psychologically or mentally?
Okay, and that's what Rashi says. Rashi says the first mention of growth is in terms of physical stature, and the second mention is in the attainment of rank, as Pharaoh had at this point appointed him over his household. So that's Rashi. I want to look at maybe another idea, but that's one. Bobby and then Ken.
At what point
And then Judy.
did Moses realize he was not an Egyptian, that he was...
Oh, okay, we're going to get to that. We're going to get to that. I think this is it, but
That's what I thought.
I was basically going to probably say the same thing. Basically, the second growing up was his maturing to appreciate the
Yeah.
injustice that was happening. But while I have the microphone, I'll also say you mentioned that his name when he was born, there's some rabbinic thing here. It says here that his name was Tobiah. I'm
Oh,
told.
right. Okay, very nice. Very nice. Also, Yakutiel. He had a couple different.
It occurs to me that after he is born, he is taken back to his birth mother to be nursed.
Right.
So we don't know how long she nursed him, but he was living in her home
That's right.
all that time. We also don't know whether he was ever circumcised, so that
Well,
may be another issue.
right. According to the Talmud, he was born circumcised, and that was one of the miracles that.
Okay, if you say so. But while he
I don't say so. The Talmud does.
But it seems to me that when he was living with his birth mother, and he was being nursed by that mother, and he was living in her home. And it's not until he was weaned that he could go to live in the palace.
Very good.
So he had two different
Very good.
lives. at
Right,
that
which is
point.
what I was trying to hint at before. Exactly right. Yeah. Can we pass the mic back, Tylee?
This whole idea that Rashi says that the second growing up was the growing up into more chiefdom in the society kind of thing
Yeah.
falls apart when the slave says, "Who made you chief and ruler over us?" Because wouldn't they know if he already had that position?
No, the position was over Pharaoh's household, not over other people.
Oh.
According to Rashi, it says al beito, in his home, not anything to do with Jews. So yeah, but who knows? I don't know. Okay, one of the original questions I asked was, how do we know who Moses' parents are? If it doesn't act, it just says a man from the house of Levi and a woman from the house of Levi. There are other people of Levi. So if you just skip with me to chapter 6, verse 20. I just want to show you one other verse. Chapter 6, verse 20 of Exodus. Anyone have it? Page 421. Nancy, can we get you a mic? I'll give it. I just need to get this away from those guys anyway.
Chapter 6, verse 20. Amram took to wife his father's sister, Jochebed, and she bore him Aaron and Moses, and the span of Amram's life was 137 years.
Okay, so there it is in the Torah. There it is in the Torah. Amram and Jochebed are the parents of Aaron and Moses. It doesn't mention Miriam here, but it does mention, and it tells you also that they're Levites and so forth. And so, but there's one more clue here that's interesting to us. And you sort of have to look at the Hebrew to pick this up. But in the verse 20, it says, Vayikach Amram, and Amram took et Jochebed, Dodato. Now, I don't know how your translation deals with the word Dodato, but does anyone know what a dod is? A dod is an uncle, and a doda is an aunt. So, it looks here like he married, I mean, if you translate that word literally, doda, toe, the toe means his. It's a contraction of aunt and his, dodato. Literally, it says he married his aunt. Okay? Now, you could say, according to Torah law, that's illegal. However, the Torah hasn't been given yet. The same way that Jacob was allowed to marry two sisters living outside the land of Israel, normally you're not allowed to, you can't marry two sisters. Jacob did. Oh, but the Torah wasn't given. Okay, so there maybe he was able to do this, but it looks like he married his aunt. However, have you ever heard, in weddings sometimes, one spouse will say to the other, Ani ledodi, ledodi li. Right? Ani ledod, dod, uncle. Dodi, when you add the E, it means my. So, at every wedding you've ever been to, people aren't saying, I'm to my uncle and my aunt is to me. Right? That's not what... Dod can also mean, Ani ledodi, I am to my beloveds, and my beloveds is to me. So it could just mean that the Torah was getting a little poetic and saying, no, it's not his aunt. He married his beloved. How wonderful. Doesn't say that for anybody else. Everyone else gets married. This guy met that. He met her. She was the only one at the well. So I'm not sure. But it's possible that Yocheved married, so that Levi, I'm losing my mind, Amram, who was a Levite, married his aunt, who was also a Levite, and her name was Yocheved. Those are the only two verses we have about their relationship.
The women's Torah translated.
Oh, good Lord.
Amram took to wife his father's sister.
Okay. That's why I always tend to lean towards the women's comment.
Also,
Love when it agrees with me.
just like with Abraham's wife, she was much older, and his sister, Miriam, prophesied that her mother was going to give birth to the Savior of the Jewish people.
Right, very good. Miriam was much older. That's right. Okay, so I want to point something out. The Chizkuni, 1200s in France, a very interesting commentary on the Torah. If you look at the first source on the sheet, here's what he says about the relationship of Amram and Yocheved, Moses' parents. By the way, why am I even talking about this? Because I'm curious about Moses growing up. We saw that the Torah said he grew up twice. We're trying to figure out what that means. We also saw that we skipped from when he was a few weeks old to now he's already grown up and he sees the suffering of his people. And I want to say something interesting, I think, about that in a moment. But first, look what the Chizkuni said. Let's see. Do you guys have a mic over here? Judy, grab it. Yes. Would you mind reading the Chizkuni?
Amram married his aunt Yocheved. The only reason that seems feasible in understanding why God agreed to such great people as Moses and his siblings being born from a union that the Torah would forbid once it was revealed at Mount Sinai, is the rule that we do not appoint a person to the highest position. We do not appoint a person to the highest position in the land unless the people were aware of at least something inappropriate that such a person had been guilty of actively or passively before his appointment. This rule, if enforced, would diminish the chances of such high-ranking people allowing their high office to develop feelings of superiority to those around them. The best-known example of the rule is King David, one of whose ancestors was Ruth the Moabite, a people with whom intermarriage was strictly prohibited by the Torah. He was reminded of this repeatedly during his life, not only his fitness as king being questioned, but even his claim to be Jewish.
Amazing, isn't it? It's an unbelievable idea.
Isn't it for humility?
Oh, yeah, because, you could say, well, if someone says, you're not a real Jew. Really? Well, King David, well, Moses came from, whatever. That's really beautiful. And for all the people in the world who sit around and say, well, you're not Jewish because your great-grandson's mother, or your great-grandfather's mother's uncle's cousin's rabbi, went to HUC, so you're not Jewish. And I say, well, you know what the Chizkuni says about that. It's a very interesting idea. Okay, one more, a piece of Talmud now, from a tractate called Bava Batra. You probably heard there's 3 tractates start with Bava, not Brava. Bravas are like potatoes you can get like at Pub Belly. They're delicious. There's Korean kimchi and potatoes. This is Bava, not Bravas. So Bava means gate in Aramaic, and there's 3 of them: Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, and Bava Batra. And they are the 3 tractates in the Talmud having to do with what's called nezikin, damages. So if you want to know if your ox falls into your neighbor's pit, or someone stole your sweater, but you will still own half of that sweater, and you want to spend 3 months trying to figure out who owns the sweater, you can go to Bava Metzia. Okay. But occasionally when you're doing that, you get very bits and pieces of interesting stuff. I have to tell you, I just started a new tractate of Talmud. I was doing Bava Kama, and I finished Bava Kama. And I just started a tractate called Ta'anit. Anyone ever heard of Ta'anit? Ta'anit's about fasting days. So it starts off with when do you pray for rain? It's very interesting. It's talking about when you pray for rain, and all of a sudden, it mentions something about the nature of rabbinic students and young rabbis. And it's just fascinating because I'm reading, I'm like, wow, yeah, that was me. Because it was just said something very interesting about the nature of young rabbis, and it's incredible stuff. So now, everyone, you're in Bava Batra, you're learning about different things, and all of a sudden you get an interesting nugget about Moses and Yocheved and Amram and so forth. So here we are. Ken, would you take Bava Batra, page 120a, the verse?
The verse concerning Amram's marriage to Yocheved states, "And a man of the house of Levi went and took as a wife a daughter of Levi." The Gemara asks, since Yocheved had already been married to Amram for some years, as Miriam and Aaron were already born, the verse should have stated, "And he took back as a wife," as he took back as a wife.
All right, so what this means is the Torah comes in the beginning of chapter 2 of Exodus and says, and Amram married Yocheved and they had a son. No kidding. Moses, Aaron, and Miriam have been born for years. What do you mean they're just getting married? They got married a long time ago. So the Talmud's asking the question, why does the Torah come and tell us at Moses' birth they got married? We will figure out once we see that Miriam is already much older, that they've been married for a long time. So that's the question.
Rav Yehuda bar Zavida says, the wording of the verse teaches that Amram performed for her a formal act of marriage as though he were marrying her for the first time. He seated her in a bridal palanquin, apiron, and Aaron and Miriam were singing before her, and the ministering angels were saying, "A joyful mother of children."
Right, so we've now started, if you get married here, for an additional fee, we bring out the palanquin. We bring it out. So you have that to live. Right. Okay, now, the question is then, or the implication is, they were separated. Amram and Yocheved separated. Probably you've all, I want to look at one more piece of Talmud. Probably you've all heard this story before. Well, there's a chance you've heard this story before. It's a famous story about why they got separated. Now, this is different. Later on, we're going to see Moses and Zipporah get separated, which I want to allude to that in a moment. But at the time, Amram and Yocheved were separated, and it was Miriam who played an interesting role in bringing them back together, okay, their daughter. So, Ed, would you mind reading the Talmud? This is a section of Talmud now from a tractate called Sota.
A sage teaches, Amram, the father of Moses, was the great man of his generation. Once he saw that the wicked Pharaoh said, "Every son that is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive," he said, "We are laboring for nothing by bringing children into the world to be killed." Therefore he arose and divorced his wife. All others who saw this followed his example and arose and divorced their wives.
Right, so all of the men said, if Pharaoh's going to kill all the boys, well, we're not going to have any more children, and we're going to separate from our wives. Okay, so that's, and Amram, we see, was obviously a leader because when he did something, everyone else followed. So that's what we have so far, and Miriam was not okay with this plan. Okay.
His daughter Miriam said to him, "Father, your decree is more harsh for the Jewish people than that of Pharaoh, as Pharaoh decreed only with regard to the males, but you decreed both on the males and on the females. And now no children will be born."
Okay, and in that line, Miriam saved the Jewish people. The real savior of the Jewish people is Miriam. Because if it wasn't for Miriam, Moses never would have been born. No Jews would ever be born again. That would have been it. So according to this section of Talmud, Miriam just saved the Jewish people. Okay, let's keep going.
Additionally, Pharaoh decreed to kill them only in this world, but you decreed in this world and in the world to come, as those not born will not enter the world to come. Miriam continued, additionally, concerning Pharaoh the wicked, it is uncertain whether his decree will be fulfilled, and it is uncertain if his decree will not be fulfilled. You are a righteous person, as in such your decrees will certainly be fulfilled, as it is stated with regard to the righteous. You shall also decree a thing, and it shall be established unto you. Amram accepted his daughter's words, and arose and brought back, i.e., remarried his wife, and all others who saw this followed his example and arose and brought back their wives.
Amazing. Huh? Have any of you heard that story before? Yeah. Okay. It's a good one. It's a good one. Okay. Now, this informs, I've heard this story many, many times, but only this week when I was listening to a Rabbi, Ari Khan, who I love very much, discussing it, he pointed something out very interesting to me that I just hadn't put two and two together. So, remember when Miriam gets punished for speaking Lashon Hara? And her punishment is what? The leprosy, or whatever it's called, Sara'at. She gets outside the camp, and ultimately she doesn't get to go to the land of Israel because of this. So what was the Lashon Hara? What was she saying? The Cushite woman who you have taken, right? But what did he say about her? What was, according to the rabbis anyway, what was she mad about? They separated. Very good. Moses had separated from Zipporah. Now, why did Moses separate from Zipporah? Because God said to all of the Jews at Mount Sinai, in 3 days you're going to hear the word of God, and so all you men need to stay away from your women for 3 days so that you're completely pure and you don't become impure from their impurity, because you need to be pure when you hear the voice of God. So Moses reasoned to himself, well, I hear the voice of God every day. So that means that I can never have contact with a woman ever again. And he separates from his wife. Well, God didn't tell him to do that. Moses did that on his own. And God said, it's fine. It's not, I would have preferred that you didn't do that, but okay. But Miriam was very angry about it. And Miriam said that's what she was gossiping about, and that's why she was punished. But here's the thing. Miriam saw her role as family counselor. It worked last time. When I lectured my parents that they needed to get back together, it worked. So now I'm telling my brother, Aaron, that I think our other brother, Moses, and his wife, they should get back together too. But this time, instead of Amram and Yocheved listening to her and Miriam being the savior of the Jewish people, she gets punished. Now, what's the difference? At least according to the Talmud, Miriam spoke directly to her father and said, here's what I think's wrong. And he said, I agree with you. In the case of Miriam with Aaron, she doesn't go right to Moses. She speaks behind his back to their brother. Now, to me, the punishment seems a little harsh. I mean, she was right to bring it up. She brought it up the first time, and we see that she was right. Maybe the lesson is that you need to go right to the source of the person that you want to rebuke or criticize or give feedback to, as opposed to go through somebody else. But what I just found interesting was that Miriam thought that it was her place to speak to Moses because she had done it in the past with her parents, and it worked. Which is, it's an interesting series of events. Okay, there was a very interesting question that was asked before by someone, I forget who it was, was that when exactly did he become aware of the suffering of his people, and is that what signifies that he grew up? Is that when he finally became a social action rabbi? Or a social justice rabbi, which is like the highest form of HUC's dreams. Okay. All right, this is a different class. Yeah.
I thought there was kind of a whole story to that fight between the two.
Yes.
And I think that was a prophetic kind of awakening.
100%. Oh, yeah, could you use the mic so they can hear you at home?
I thought that Moses' recognition of the fighting between the two Hebrews was, in a sense, a prophetic evidence of who he was going to be, and also an indication of his growth. I think he recognized that what we've said many times and in many other situations, that fighting among the Jews themselves was what could threaten the future of Jews.
100%. So there's a teaching from the Maharal of Prague. Actually descend from the Maharal. I don't know if any of you have heard of the Maharal of Prague, but according to our family tree, we descend from him. I once mentioned that in a cab ride in Israel. And I was talking to someone, we were talking about our family trees, and the cab driver pulled over. He was in shock. He couldn't believe it. I said, hey, it's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. Read my book, whatever. So the Maharal of Prague says something very interesting about the point you just made. And if you look at verse 12, so chapter 2, verse 12, it says, he turned this way and that and saw that there was no man. And he struck the Egyptian. And that's a turning point. The actual physical, whatever he did, whether he said a prayer, and there's lots of different explanations of how he actually killed this man. But the Hebrew is Vayach et HaMitzri. And he struck the Egyptian. Vayitmenehu bachol. And he hit him in the sand. Okay, so the Maharal of Prague's commentary here says this. I didn't bring it on the sheet, but here's what he says. When Moses hits the Egyptian, back to Bob's point, when Sipporah, Bob, when you were asking about Sipporah, when Moses meets Sipporah, his wife, Sipporah goes to Jethro, and Jethro said, who helped you out? And she said, an Egyptian man. Because he was dressed like an Egyptian. He looked at his hands weren't dirty. He didn't look like a slave. Came from the palace. So she referred to him as an Egyptian, which is not how we want to think of our Moses, right? But here, Vayach et HaMitzri, he struck the Egyptian. The Maharal of Prague says that this means that Moses, when he struck the Egyptian, he was actually beating the Egyptian out of him. Now, where does he get that? This is very interesting. The word HaMitzri, the Egyptian, and the word Moshe in Hebrew have the same gematria. If you add up the letters of Moshe and HaMitzri, they both equal 345, which is really interesting. So the Maharal of Prague says there's two Moseses. There's Moses, Moshe, and there's Moses, HaMitzri. And when he gets rid of the Mitzri and hides that away in the sand, he's left with just his Moshe. And the Maharal says that's why these are the same. And if you remember when we said he grew up twice, the first time he grew up, Yeled. He's just Stam, he's just a boy. But the second time, Vayigdal, he's now Moshe. He's not HaMitzri, he's Moshe. So that's the Maharal of Prague on that, which I think is an interesting. Do you have a microphone? And then after Richard? Do we have a mic on this side? No. Oh, here. Well, now we're really invested in this comment.
I'm going back.
All right.
When I was reading this earlier in the week, and thank you for unpacking the change in the man from the moment of death, I looked at the killing of that Egyptian as almost his first act as leadership of the Jewish people.
Yeah.
And when I was listening this morning about the first two guys that he's called upon to lead, call them out. Who made you the leader over us? I thought, how ironic. This guy's going to spend the rest of his life, doing the best that he can to take these people out of this Mitzrayim that they find themselves. And the first two guys he's encountered are already giving him grief. And I think we've been a difficult people to lead from that moment to this.
That's for sure. I can tell you that for a fact. Victor?
I wanted to bring up a parallel with the Parashat Noah. When God told Noah to build an ark, and he called him a teva.
Yes.
And then for
Very good.
Moses, he also got a teva. It's translated as a little basket. The other one is translated as a big ark. Both of them had to be waterproof with bitumen. To my knowledge, it's the only two instances in the Torah that we're talking about vessels.
Yeah.
And in the one occasion, the big ark was used to save humanity. On this occasion, the tiny little vessel was used to save the Jewish people.
And save the world. How did Moses save the world? He brought the Torah into the world. And the world can't exist without Torah. So 100%. Now, this is exactly where I wanted to go. And to talk about the differences. Now that we've looked a little bit at Moses' childhood, I want to try to show there are a tremendous amount. I mean, you just pointed out one of the big ones. But there's a tremendous amount of comparison between the beginning of Genesis and the beginning of Exodus. And if you can figure out some of those, we can answer a question that maybe you've waited your whole life to be answered. A question that the Torah asks, that everyone here knows this question by heart. I don't want to give it away yet. Everyone knows this question by heart, but you all know the question. But you probably don't know the answer. Don't give it away. Don't give it away. I heard you say it. Don't give it away. We all know the question, but we might not know the answer. Although you got it quicker than I thought anyone would, which I'm impressed, but keep it to yourself. Now, I want to point out, if you'll just... So I have a lot to explain in 13 minutes, but if you could look with me now, back at Exodus chapter 1, verse 14. Exodus chapter 1, verse 14. We're doing a lot of machinations today to get to a certain point, but hopefully it'll be worth it. So, if someone asked you the question, what did the Jews do all day when they were slaves? Like, whoa, so most people, oh yeah, they built the pyramids. Well, you know, the pyramids were tombs for the pharaohs. How many pyramids did they need over the time that the Jews were slaves? How many pharaohs died over that time? You know, you had the job for life. You know, you think all they did was build pyramids all day? And that's one of the first things they teach in the rabbinic school is the Jews didn't build the pyramids. And then you walk out of there like, this place is not for me. This is crazy. Of course they built the pyramids. Class 2 is that Moses never split the Red Sea. Okay. Look at verse 14. And they embittered their lives with hard work, with mortar and with bricks. Okay, so they were building buildings, I'm sure, based on this. But then it says, Uvachol avodah b'sadeh, and with all the work in the field. What does that mean? What did they do in the fields? Farm, pick. Right. Okay. Now, if you were to look in Genesis, you don't know, I'll just read it. But Genesis chapter 2, verse 15. So what we're looking now at is Exodus 1. But if we looked at Genesis 2, it says this, verse 15. Vayikach Hashem Elokim, and the Lord God took et Adam, man, vayinichehu began Eden, and he placed him in the Garden of Eden. In the garden, right? Gan, when you think of garden, it means you think of green and field and so forth. La'ovda. And we usually translate that as to till it. Right? T-I-L-L, to till it. La'ovda. The same word here, avdu, or avodah basadeh, to work in the fields. And what I'm showing you now is that what Adam and Eve were doing in the Garden of Eden is no different than what the Jews were doing in Egypt. They were fielding the land. Okay? Now, there's one other interesting idea about this. Let me just see if I didn't even bring I only brought Exodus with me. But I think if you look, I'll just read it here. Genesis 4, verse 8 says this. Okay, so Genesis chapter 4, verse 8, I'll just read it to you. Vayomer Cain el Hevel. Cain said to Abel, Achav, his brother, Vayhi beyotam basadeh. And it's when they were in the field. Vayakam Cain, and came upon El Hevel, to his brother Abel, Achiv, his brother. Vayargeu, and he killed him. So, when the Jews become slaves, they're put out in the field. When Adam and Eve are put in the Garden of Eden, they're put in the field. Everyone's working in the field. When Cain comes upon Abel, they're in the field. And he kills him. Okay. And then there's this famous question when God comes to Cain and says, where's your brother? And what does he say? See, you all know the question. That's the question. Am I my brother's keeper? And what's God's answer? Yes. Yeah? Why is God's answer yes? What does God say specifically? So he says this. Vayomer. And God said to Cain, Ma'asita, what have you done? Kol demei achicha. The voice of the cries of your brother's blood, soakim alai min ha'adama, from the field that you're supposed to be working. Right? From the ground. In other words, you think I don't know where your brother is? Let me explain to you how this whole thing works. I'm up here, you're down there, I see everything. And he says, yeah, you're your brother's keeper. Now, does Cain really know the answer when he asks the question? Or is he legitimately saying, who cares? What does that have to do with me? And then death comes into the world. Right? There's the first death. And you could legitimately say, maybe Cain didn't know what death was. Like he hit him and he's like, why aren't you getting up? He's dead. What's dead? Never heard of that. I don't know what that is. How would he? Never happened. Get up. Okay, I see it hurts. That's why I hate you, but I didn't mean to kill you. Whatever, okay. I don't know, maybe cut his, whatever. So he asks, am I my brother's keeper? And God tells him, going forward from this point forward, everyone should know, yes, you're your brother's keeper. How do we know when Moses has grown up? When he becomes his brother's keeper. That's it. That's it. So that's the answer to the question. Am I my brother's keeper? Was the question that Genesis put forward. But the answer is yes. So let's go back now to chapter 2, verse 10 and 11. So chapter 2 of Exodus, verse 11. Vayhi bayamim ahem, and it was in those days, whatever that means. Let's see what the first mention. Okay, we already talked about that. Vayigdal Moshe grew up. Vayitzei el echav. And he went out to his brethren. Vayar b'sivlotam, he saw their suffering. Vayar ish mitzri, and he saw an Egyptian man. Makeh ish ivri, hitting a Hebrew man. Me'achav. And he realized that the Egyptians were not his brothers. The Jews were his brothers. So the last commentary on the sheet that I brought is from the Sforno, 16th century Italy. He made it his concern to take a benevolent interest in the affliction suffered by his brother. So two things happened. One, the first time he grows up, he says, I want to go see what's going on with my people. I want to go and see, take an interest and see what's happening. The second time he grows up, he gets in the game. And now he has real skin in the game, so much so that, he has to flee Egypt because he thinks Pharaoh's going to kill him because he killed one of Pharaoh's men. So there's a difference between going out and seeing, oh, isn't this horrible that people are suffering, and getting in the game. It's a little bit, well, I don't want to get into that, but there's some funny comparisons. And then, all right, a couple more comments, and I'll wrap it up and try and say what I mean. Judith?
Yeah, so he kills the Egyptian, but how does the Torah deal with the fact that he kills someone when later in the Ten Commandments, one of the major commandments is thou shalt not kill?
It's a good question. So, let's see what Rashi says. So, look, according to Rashi, now Rashi takes this from the Midrash. You have to ask about how did Moses kill the guy? So, right, the Torah says vayach. He struck. It's the same word that used when he hits the rock to get the water. It's the same Hebrew word. The Torah, the Rashi and the Midrash is no, he didn't actually touch him. He said God's ineffable name, whatever that is, and asked God to intervene. And God's intervention was to kill this guy who was probably going to kill the Jew. So halachically, there are a lot of things you could say here. There's two things you could say. There's two things you could do. You could read Ronan Bergman, Rise and Kill First. Anyone read that book? Yeah, which is the principle of Israel defending itself before. It's an amazing book. But there's a mitzvah that says if someone breaks into, this is in the Torah. If someone breaks into your home, you're allowed to rise and kill first. If someone breaks into your home and is going to kill you, you are allowed to rise up and kill them before they kill you. Okay. So, and then from that you can extrapolate all kinds of different types of things. But according to the tradition, midrashically anyway, Moses never actually struck the guy. Did he actually strike the guy? The video is grainy. It's hard to tell. I can't make it out. I can't make it out. So I don't know. I wasn't there. Also, Torah hadn't been given yet, so Moses wouldn't know that commandment. But there was another comment before I conclude. Yeah? Oh no, someone have a hand up? No. Okay, good. Okay, so Richard. Can we pass the mic back? It's coming.
I read the stuff every week, and it jumps out at me that my life is addressed every week in some way, shape, or form by Torah. There were over 400 reported acts of anti-Semitism in this country within the last week. And the rise is inevitable, it's palpable. And the feeling of hatred for Jews for no reason other than they're Jews is becoming more and more a part of my consciousness. And when I read this week, the Egyptian was beating the Hebrew for no reason other than the fact that he was a Hebrew.
Right. Very good. Very good. So there's a lot you could talk about with anti-Semitism with this Torah portion. And I could have gone that way, but yeah.
But it does say Moses struck him, right? So, but maybe what makes it okay is what Richard just said.
Yeah.
To try to extinguish anti-Semitism. I mean, it wasn't just anti-Semitism. The Egyptian was beating the Jewish men.
Right. Right.
So.
Look, and struck's an interesting word. God struck the Egyptians with darkness. Well, what does that mean? Did he actually touch them? No, he just turned the lights off.
What does the Hebrew word mean? That the struck.
Yeah,
Hebrew word.
vayach, it means and he struck. But it doesn't necessarily, so in the case of the rock, he did hit it with the staff.
How do you know the difference between striking this Egyptian and striking that rock with the word struck?
Midrash.
Midrash,
tells you.
okay.
So, or you can make it up. That's called your own midrash. That's called your own midrash. All right, Pamela and then Bobby, and then we got to conclude. Can we pass the mic? Yeah, we need it so they can hear you at home.
I'm just thinking about this concept with striking the rock, and you had mentioned striking the rock like striking the Egyptian. If he didn't actually strike the Egyptian, I'm wondering if he actually struck the rock. That's one idea. But the other idea is that this striking with the plagues and with the rock, and it presages something changing. It presages a significant time of change so it's like a turning point in a story.
Right.
And
Very
that
good.
just is what struck me.
Very good. Very good. Bobby, last one. Then we got to wrap up. It's coming.
It's still hard to tell from Torah whether or not Moses had a sense of social justice, sees a slave being beaten by one of his Egyptians, or whether or not he had a revelation that these are my people and I am my brother's keeper.
Right.
I think there is no clarity in the Torah. We have to read the Midrash and determine that these are both one and the same event.
Yeah. So I think I'm just looking for the verse that I wanted to end on. Okay, yeah. So when Cain goes to strike Abel, we see him say the word his brother. And then we see again, when God asks him, where's your brother? And he says, am I my brother's keeper? And God says, I hear your brother's voice screaming out, there's blood screaming out from the ground. And you see the word ach 3 or 4 times there. Now here also, once Moses grows up, at the end of verse 11, Moses grows up. Look what it says here. It happened in those days. Moses grew up and went out to his brethren. Went out. The Hebrew word is echav. It's the same word we use with Cain and Abel. He went out to his brothers. That's what it means to grow up. He went out to his brothers. And then he saw an Egyptian and a Hebrew, and he recognized that the one who was his brother was the Hebrew. And so Genesis leaves this open question for us. Am I my brother's keeper? Moses comes with the answer. Like the Maharal of Prague said, Vayach et Mitzri, this, according to the Maharal of Prague, this story may never even happen. The Egyptian beating the Hebrew may have just been Moses looking in the mirror. There may never have been an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. It might have just means to teach us, according to the Maharal of Prague, and that's why Moshe and Hamitzri both equal 345, that what Moses was doing was saying, I see that I'm an Egyptian and I see that I'm a Hebrew, but really, only now do I finally grow up, I recognize I'm a Hebrew. And that's what it means to grow up, and that's when he joins the fight. So this whole thing with, maybe he mentioned God's name, because that's when, not because he was killing some Egyptian, that may never even have happened. That may all be a metaphor. He may have just been connecting with God and saying, oh, I see what side I'm on. I'm going out to join with my people. And so Moses is the one who comes and says, am I my brother's keeper? That's exactly what it means to be Jewish, is to be your brother's keeper. That's when he goes out and joins the fight. And I have to tell you, people who I thought could not have cared less about being Jewish, since October 7th, you see that it's in there. We all have it. It's just a question of at what point do you grow up and recognize that it rises to the surface. Okay, Shabbat Shalom. Have a safe trip.